In many democratic countries, school elections are periodically performed among teenage pupils to determine how the soon-to-be voters are politically leaning. The standard usually was that the youth is significantly more left-leaning than the general population, especially if we concentrate more on the cultural axis of the right-left dichotomy. The idealistic youth usually tends to be more open-minded, liberal, and free-spirited, devoted to the struggle for the betterment of the world and its many injustices, while the older and more experienced person, who has already been lessened by the experience of the real world, remains skeptical and conservative. As the famous quote, prescribed most often to Winston Churchill, but also to several other historical figures, says, quote, "If a man is not a socialist by the time he is 20, he has no heart. If he is not a conservative by the time he is 40, he has no brain." End of quote. But in recent years, a new seismic shift seems to be emerging in the rapidly changing socio-demographic landscape of contemporary Western countries. The young people are getting more right-wing and conservative than their parents, especially young men, since this change of ideological course among the youth is first and foremost caused by the palpable shift of young Western males to political right. One of the most prominent examples of this phenomenon is Sweden. Between the 2018 and 2022 school elections in Sweden, there has been a massive increase of almost 17% in support for parties on the Swedish political right among Swedish pupils. Consider that these results are not differentiated by gender or immigration background. Consequently, if we consider that both young girls and pupils of certain immigration backgrounds very likely tend to be more left-leaning, the predominance of the political right among ethnically Swedish boys gets straight out overwhelming. In every country, the cleavages between the political right and left take on a significantly different shape. In some countries, usually those where the political right connects its identity to Christianity, like in Poland or in the United States, cultural and ethical issues such as gay marriage or abortions still are lively and contested political topics. However, in most Western European countries, such questions are basically political non-issues at this point. According to the Pew Research Center, 95% of Swedes believe that abortions should be legal and 94% that gay marriage should be legal. In most European countries, especially Sweden, the fundamental political cleavage driving the polarization is clear: immigration and the rapid pace of ethnic change. In this regard, Sweden is the most extreme case on the European continent. It went from basically an ethno-state, which it had been for a large part of the 20th century, to being one of Europe's most ethnically diverse countries. This shift happened in a remarkably short time, over one generation. A Swede who is in his 40s was born in a country that was 99% European and about 90% Swedish. According to many projections, he might very well retire in a country that will be less than 50% ethnically Swedish and 20 to 30% Muslim. Only a remarkably naive or ideologically motivated person could presume this won't significantly impact the country. So, let's dive into the tale of Sweden. My friend, fan of this channel and fellow demographic enthusiast, David Lorentzon, who is Swedish, helped me a lot with many of statistics and data for this video by providing his insights and translating a lot of stuff for me from Swedish. So, thank you, David. I will start by describing the Swedish anthropological roots as outlined by the one and only Emanuel Todd. Sweden is a country that was historically dominated by the authoritarian family system, similar to German-speaking Europe. This family system is characterized by the unequal division of the inheritance between the children, a system that is called primogeniture. The oldest child, most often the oldest son, inherits the whole family property, traditionally a farm, while the younger siblings get nothing. The daughters are married away, and the younger sons must find their own fortune in the world. The oldest son and his family live with his parents and under the father's authority until the father dies, and then the son becomes the new head of the household, repeating the described process with his own children. Since this family system's principal aim and function is to secure the succession from one generation to the next, such countries are equipped with a highly developed sense of ethnically exclusive identity, since every peasant perceived himself as a protector of his ancient family line. This traditionally rigid family structure instills discipline, obedience to authority, and internal cohesion within such societies, since they are equipped with a high level of tolerance towards inequality. If siblings are naturally seen as unequal, then people in general, different social classes, nations, ethnic groups, and races, are also seen as naturally unequal. Now, this might sound a little bit counterintuitive at first. Isn't Sweden seen as the paradigm of equality? Well, it is a little bit more complex. The aforementioned tolerance towards inequality has an interesting twist within itself. Since the family property does not get diluted every generation by the rules on equal division of inheritance common in egalitarian family types, there is a powerful anthropological force working against the natural tendency towards wealth concentration that is common in capitalist systems. In countries with egalitarian family systems that were culturally fixated on equal inheritance between the children, this has paradoxically led to constant fragmentation of the rural holdings that could then be easily bought up by big landowners. Consequently, countries culturally predisposed towards equality, such as Spain, Portugal, Poland, or Latin America, often had massive levels of economic inequality and a huge population of rural proletariat working on big latifundia. These socio-economic patterns are often relevant to the present day. On the contrary, countries with authoritarian, unegalitarian family types usually were and are relatively economically equal due to the tradition of small, self-sufficient rural property owners. That is usually translated to strong, middle-class dominated societies in contemporary times. In the words of Emmanuel Todd, quote, "The authoritarian family transmits inegalitarian values, but encourages a social practice which is egalitarian. The egalitarian family type transmits egalitarian values, but encourages inegalitarian social practice. The continuity of family property leads to economic excellence, since the skills and the know-how get transmitted from generation to generation in long, unbroken chains. Like in Germany, many of the largest and most successful Swedish companies are family-owned. There is a Swedish family, the Wallenbergs, that many people outside of Sweden might never have heard of, but it is one of the most powerful and wealthiest families in Europe and possibly the world. Overall, the Swedish business culture is indeed remarkable. I do not think there is another country with a relatively small population such as Sweden, with only 10.5 million people, with a comparable amount of world-renowned brands. IKEA, H&M, Volvo, Spotify, Saab, and so on. Sweden is the only country of its size that can autonomously develop and manufacture fighter jets. It clearly punches above its weight, even in the realm of cultural exports. Politically, there are also some highly specific traits. While countries with the authoritarian family type can produce some of the nastiest, ethnically violent militaristic regimes, like Japan or Nazi Germany, they can also produce flourishing democracies. Democracy in authoritarian countries then usually exhibits remarkable levels of stability, one that seems almost undemocratic in a way. In the European context, this usually took the shape of complete domination of the political landscape by two gigantic parties, social democracy on the left and Christian democracy on the right. These two parties were present in basically every country in continental Europe throughout the 20th century. But in the countries with the authoritarian family system, they have dominated to an almost ridiculous degree. The tendency of the people to obey authorities and to be highly disciplined does not evaporate even if there are free and fair elections. Sweden is one of the best examples of this phenomenon. Between 1936 and 2006, the Social Democrats were in power for 62 years out of the 70. Between 1942 and 1986, just 3 socialist prime ministers, Per Albin Hansson, Tage Erlander and Olof Palme, ruled Sweden for almost 50 out of the 54 years. The Social Democratic Party election results exceeded 50% during the 1940 and 1968 elections. Swedish social democracy also wasn't the kind of universal international proletariat organization calling for a socialist world revolution you could see in many other European states during that time, especially Spain, France or Russia. It was explicitly based on the idea of solidarity within the ethnically defined Swedish nation, which was seen as a big family where people should all contribute to the common good and look after each other. This worldview, called Folkhemmet or People's Home, was introduced by Per Albin Hansson, the socialist prime minister who ruled Sweden from 1932 to 1946. The Swedish social democracy thus basically had a monopoly on Swedish politics throughout the bulk of the 20th century. The only other democratic country with a similar political monopoly by one party is Japan, another authoritarian family nation, where the Liberal Democratic Party has won every election except one since 1958 and often gets around 60% of the vote. One of the hallmark political programs in the period of socialist domination in Sweden was the so-called Million Program. It was a massive housing program implemented between 1965 and 1974, encompassing the building of 1 million new housing units. This goal was accomplished, but the issue was that Swedes did not really want to live in the newly built housing. Sweden had only about 6 million people at that time, and since it is a vast country, it had a relatively low population density. Swedes just preferred to live in houses, and not in the large apartment complexes that were basically the same as commie blocks in the Eastern Bloc countries. The result was a vast neighborhood of almost empty public housing on the outskirts of every larger Swedish town. That will become more important further down the line. As with most other wealthy Western European countries, there was a limited immigration inflow of workers in the post-World War II period of economic expansion. Since Sweden was neutral in the Second World War, it was one of the few industrialized countries unscattered by the war. And since it was endowed with many natural resources, it was well positioned to profit massively from the war itself, during which it exported a lot of raw materials as well as industrial products to Nazi Germany, and from the post-war economic miracle. Its economy was absolutely booming in the 1945 to 1973 period, and it needed more workers. They came from Italy, Yugoslavia, Turkey, Finland, or Hungary. And as usual, this initial immigration wave was quite successful. The problems came later. In my previous video about Canada, I talked about how the decline of the British loyalist identity opened the door for the left modernist ideology to be fiercely adopted by the Anglo-Canadian elites. In Sweden, the process was in some ways similar. Not that the Swedish national identity would have issues to define itself, but maybe also as a reaction to its ambiguous stance towards Nazi Germany during the war, Sweden accepted a sort of messianic foreign policy position, seeing itself as a pacifist moral superpower of sorts. One of the defining traits of this foreign policy was the reorientation of immigration policy to refugees and persecuted peoples. This shift happened under the socialist Prime Minister Olof Palme in the 1970s, and in 1975, a unanimous Swedish parliament voted in favor of a new immigrant and minority policy that explicitly rejected the previous policy of assimilation and ethnocultural homogeneity in favor of state-sponsored multiculturalism. Since then, Sweden has been wide open to refugees from basically everywhere. People fleeing communist persecution in Poland, the colonial's regime in Greece, leftists fleeing the persecution of Augusto Pinochet's regime in Chile, the opposition to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, refugees from wars in Somalia, the war in Bosnia, Iraqis, Algerians, Afghans, and finally the Syrians in 2015. Throughout the whole period, there was always a place to house the refugees, since there was an empty neighborhood full of apartments on the outskirts of every significant Swedish city or town. The result is almost complete segregation of the native population from the immigrant communities. In many parts of Sweden, even in some major metropolitan areas, one would not guess that Sweden is a high immigration country. However, this fact only helped perpetuate the illusion of harmonious society, while significant problems were brewing under the lid the whole time. Today, Sweden is around 69% ethnically Swedish and 31% ethnically of foreign origin. It must be acknowledged that the demographics of the ethnically Swedish population have been relatively stable over the past 2 decades, around 7.5 million, but the overall population of Sweden has ballooned to 10.5 million almost purely by mass immigration, which accelerated especially in the 2000s. Sweden did not need anywhere close to the levels of immigration it received to satisfy the needs of its labor market. The Swedish economy is also highly sophisticated and automatized, with relatively low demand for low-skilled labor. As usual, a part of the population of immigration background is of European or another Western origin, but the majority comes from non-Western backgrounds, most predominantly Syria, Iraq, Iran, Somalia, Afghanistan, Turkey, or Eritrea. In the case of Sweden, there is really no way to sugarcoat it. The effects of non-European immigration are disastrous. You can pull up whatever statistic you want, they all show the same result. Whether we look at crime suspects or the unemployment levels and welfare dependency, the non-European population is massively overrepresented in each case. As always, that does not mean that there are not many well-integrated non-Western immigrants, not causing any issues. There certainly are, but the statistics kind of speak for themselves. While on average, 4.8% of men in Sweden are crime suspects at some point, the figure is around 30% for men of North African or Sub-Saharan African origin born in Sweden, over 6 times the average Swedish figure. For men of Middle Eastern origin born in Sweden, it is 24%, 5 times the average. To be fair, the figure for descendants of European immigrants from outside the EU, overwhelmingly from former Yugoslavia, is also very high, around 17%, so 3 times the average. What is especially disturbing is the fact that the crime figures are even higher for men of immigration background born in Sweden than for the first generation immigrants themselves. The integration is just clearly not working in this regard. Integration and assimilation were often seen as in conflict with human rights, and the state pursued multiculturalism, which meant that Sweden, for a long time, did not take assimilation as seriously as it needed. Getting Swedish citizenship has been extremely easy for a long period of time. All you had to do was to be a registered resident in the country for 3 years. No language tests needed to be taken, no economic contributions were needed, and the criminal records were ignored. By 2021, gun crime connected to organized crime groups has increased 10 times compared to the early 1990s. Shootings and grenade attacks have become commonplace in many Swedish suburbs inhabited by populations of immigration backgrounds, and the issue have started to leak even to formerly very safe ethnically Swedish areas. In 2019, the unemployment level among the native population was around 3%, while among the non-EU born population it was over 17%. And while people usually blame the immigrants for these outcomes, and it is obviously absolutely justified and correct to blame the perpetrators of crimes for their behavior, one also has to acknowledge that a huge part of the blame goes behind the approach of the Swedish elites and establishment. Because, honestly, what were they expecting to happen? Many of these issues stem from a simple lack of recognition of the fact that Swedes are highly culturally specific people, and the vast majority of the world does not share their cultural traits. Sweden was an overwhelmingly ethnically and culturally homogeneous nation. Community and consensus-oriented, the Swedes possessed a strong work ethic, a dislike for ostentatious displays of wealth, a sense of austerity, and fondness for rustic simplicity. All of these traits inspired by their peasant roots. To think one could just alter the demographic substance of such a society without massive consequences. That you could just go on as usual, use all the same tools, and expect people coming by hundreds of thousands from completely different socio-cultural contexts to just become the same as your average Gunnar Gustafsson in a couple of years is something so blatantly naive that only a post-World War II Western leftist could possibly believe it. However, the Swedish national character might have also helped perpetuate the immigration fiasco for longer than was necessary. As was already mentioned, one of the characteristics of societies with authoritarian family types is a tendency to obey the authorities. Sweden is, or at least has been until recently, a typical high-trust society. People trust not only each other, but also the state and its leadership. That might sound a bit naive to a person from post-communist Europe, where the relationship of the people towards the state and its institution is usually very suspectful. However, it is one of the keys to Swedish success, and the Swedish state and its institutions have helped the Swedish nation to build a remarkably successful country in the last century or so. Nevertheless, in the case of immigration, the Swedish tendency for conformity and trust towards the government might have led to the government getting away with certain things more easily than elsewhere. The Swedish government had basically hidden all the statistics on the ethnicity of crime suspects between 2003 and 2018. Such statistics were only published after the 2018 Swedish general elections, likely not to damage the ruling Social Democrats' election results by openly showing the shortcomings of their immigration policy. The public discontent with the changing demographic makeup of the country and rising crime levels have, however, clearly reached a tipping point in the past couple of years. The anti-immigration Swedish Democrats Party was, for a long time, seen as a party with which no solid establishment politician would work. However, after they finished second in the 2022 general elections with 20% of the vote, the current center-right coalition was formed that closely works with the Swedish Democrats in the parliament, even though they are not formally part of the government. At the beginning of the video, I talk about the massive turn to the right among the Swedish youth. The possible explanation for this shift is once again illustrative of the specific Swedish way of handling issues connected to immigration and integration. The basic integrational tool of the Swedish government is the education educational system. Traditionally, an egalitarian school system was based on the simple premise: we have to prevent large disparities in educational outcomes based on the socio-economic background of different students. The way to do this was by merging schools based on their educational outcomes. If some schools were very successful and other much less so, we would just get these kids together and the results would stabilize somewhere in the middle. The children from working class backgrounds will mesh together with children from wealthier families, and the more successful kids will help the less successful kids. When you have a homogeneous country where almost all the kids are of the same cultural and ethnic background, this is workable. Put mass immigration in the mix, and things start to get messier. Suddenly, the young Swedish pupils become the front soldiers of the societal integrational efforts. In an extremely segregated society like contemporary Sweden, the older generation and more well-off people living in upscale ethnically homogeneous neighborhoods are not really confronted with the day-to-day impacts of their political decisions, but their children are. It is one thing if the child of a wealthy Swedish lawyer and the child of a janitor are put together. They both speak the Swedish language and share some basic sociocultural experiences common to all Swedish people. But suppose the children are suddenly intermingled with Somali and Afghan children who do not share any of these commonalities and often do not speak much Swedish at all. In that case, it is a completely different story. Apart from the obvious cultural frictions this approach inevitably causes, it also makes education itself much more complicated. As the Swedish authorities themselves have admitted, it is very hard to teach a group of pupils, some of whom are ethnic Swedes with the Swedish language as their mother tongue, while others come from diverse backgrounds with much lower knowledge of the language. In the end, it is harmful to all of the children, since the Swedish children are constantly slowed down in their classes by children who cannot speak Swedish, and the immigrant children would also be much better educated if they were separated and taught in accordance with the language level they are on. The results are alarming. According to the data, up to 27% of Swedish 15-year-old pupils basically do not have basic math skills, and up to a quarter might lack basic reading and writing skills, at least in the Swedish language. The education of both groups was sacrificed on the altar of societal integration, and the Swedish children do not like it. Before I conclude this video, there is one last interesting phenomenon happening in Sweden, which might, nevertheless, have implications even for other Western countries. I have mentioned my friend David, who helped me with this video. He has dug deep into the Swedish migratory statistics and has found an interesting gender imbalance when it comes to different source countries of immigration. In the case of many countries, there is a rather large male surplus in the immigration streams coming to Sweden, especially from Muslim countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, and Egypt. These are the classic migrants who usually came to Europe via the Mediterranean or the Balkan route to claim asylum. This migration is notoriously male-dominated. The likely reason it isn't even more male-dominated is the family reunification schemes. Other male-dominated source countries of immigration are Western countries like the UK, Italy, and Greece. In these cases, it is probably caused by the more conventional labor migration, possibly often in more male-dominated technical areas. There are no big surprises here. Where it gets more interesting are the female imbalance countries. There is a very diverse and seemingly heterogeneous group of countries from which the immigration is heavily dominated by females. Thailand, the Philippines, the post-Soviet Eastern Europe, Brazil, South Korea, China, and so on. In some cases, especially in Southeast Asian nations like Thailand or the Philippines, almost 80% of immigrants are female. Now, why is that the case? The most likely correct answer is that this is a marriage/relationship-induced immigration. Now, there are many rural communities in Sweden. Mining, agriculture, construction and industry often dominate jobs in these rural areas. Overall, these are heavily male-dominated fields. On the contrary, most women's preferred jobs, often university degree-required office jobs with female work collectives, are in the towns and cities. There is thus a persistent internal migration within Sweden, where women from rural areas and smaller towns migrate to the cities. Many rural areas thus end up with a relatively large male surpluses, reaching 15% in the most extreme cases. These rural areas with highest male surpluses are also those where the female-dominated migration is most significant. Since the Swedish economic system functions in a way in which both the man and the woman within the household must be employed to afford the middle-class lifestyle, forming a relationship in an area where the women have trouble finding employment is rather hard. But there are also other factors in play here. The overall dating crisis happening in the Western world is a topic that many other YouTube channels have very well documented. Thus, I usually do not really dive into it that much, since I would just repeat what has been said elsewhere. But in this case, the issue interestingly interplays with the themes I am primarily exploring: immigration and ethnic change. There is a clear trend in many developed countries in which young men and women are increasingly drifting apart in their basic political values and ideological leanings. In most countries, this is happening due to young women moving dramatically to the political left, especially in the cultural sense. Interestingly, it is the other way around in the Swedish case. While the views of young Swedish women have remained basically the same, the young Swedish men have moved quite sharply to the right. At a certain point, such a divide becomes a real issue in interpersonal relations. Put all of this together, the growing political divide between the genders and the lack of women in the rural areas, and the result is clear: a significant marriage migration of foreign women into Sweden. According to many surveys, Scandinavian men are seen as some of the most attractive by women of most nationalities, probably both due to their looks and the stability and wealth of the Scandinavian countries. It makes sense. And if you look at the countries from which this female-dominated migration is coming, it also starts to make more sense. Generally, it includes poorer countries that are not culturally completely incompatible. You can probably guess there won't be many wives coming from the Muslim world. And people often see them as countries where you can get the so-called trad wife. In some cases, like Japan or South Korea, the countries are not even poor. It's hard to get the precise numbers on the described marriage migration, but the safest estimate puts this at least 500,000 people, with 80% being women and 20% being men. That is a trend that will continue for as long as there is a huge gender imbalance between the rural and urban areas, an imbalance in political views between the genders, and socio-economic policies that force both partners to have full-time jobs to maintain a middle-class lifestyle. It also shows a glimpse of how the future might look in Western countries with huge differences in political views between men and women, and the continuous crisis of the dating market. The lads will just import wives from elsewhere. While such a migration flows won't make any news headlines, since there is no crime and upheaval connected to Filipino women marrying Swedish men, the cultural impacts will also be notable and interesting. While the male-dominated problematic immigration to Sweden leads mostly to societal segregation, the marriage migration leads to much more direct cultural fusion through marriage and offsprings. To somehow conclude, the Swedish case is likely the most extreme one when it comes to the European mishandling of mass immigration. Due to the combination of the peculiarities of the Swedish national culture, its remarkable homogeneity, the complete political domination and societal authority of the Swedish social democracy, and the left modernist missionary nationalism based on multicultural ideology, the pace and the scale of the ethnic change were faster than basically anywhere else in Europe. As for the future, it remains open. While the numerical proportion of the people of non-Swedish and non-European origin will inevitably rise due to the younger age structure and higher fertility, there is nothing inevitable about the future loss of the Swedish ethnic majority in the country. Most of the projections saying that Swedes will become a minority within Sweden in a couple of decades, or that the Muslim population will increase to 20 or 30% of the population, are counting on the continuous inflow of vast numbers of immigrants into Sweden. Due to the changing headwinds in Swedish society and politics, this does look very unlikely. The right-wing government is currently implementing many changes aimed at reducing immigration, and the net immigration stood at less than 30,000 in 2023, which is the lowest number in decades. While the fertility of first-generation immigrants from many non-European countries is very high, it tends to collapse relatively fast among the second-generation immigrants, often to levels even lower than the native population. If immigration is dramatically halted, the projected population growth of the non-European population will slow down accordingly. Sweden won't become Islamized, nor dominated and subjugated by foreigners. Nevertheless, Sweden is and will remain a segregated country, in which the ethnic Swedish majority, controlling the country's economic, political and security infrastructure, will share the country with numerous ethno-culturally defined socio-economic underclass that will live in a completely different world than most of the Swedes. The demographic changes are too massive to be rolled back, and the situation will inevitably drain the resources of the Swedish state and society. Sweden thus gives us two important lessons. The first one is that immigration policy is a highly delicate issue, and if it is treated ideologically and recklessly, there will be massive negative societal consequences. But the second lesson is that the course of events can be changed if a sufficient societal majority agrees upon it and votes accordingly. If you finished this video and hopefully find it interesting, I just want to once again ask for your support on my Patreon. Researching and making these videos takes quite a lot of time. I will level with you guys. The amount of money from YouTube ads isn't exactly a fortune, and with my current view counts, getting paid promotion to my videos also is not all that easy. Some time ago, I made a tier on my Patreon that is just $1 a month. That is like half of what a beer costs in Czech pubs nowadays. So, if you enjoy these videos and would like me to continue making them, please consider this form of support. It would mean the world to me. Thank you very much.